Good evening, everybody. Can y'all hear me pretty well? Good, fantastic. Welcome to another Café Sci. My name is Sarah Grummett, and I'm excited to be your host this evening. Café Sci is presented by PPG. It's also supported by wonderful folks like yourself. Thank you to everyone who donates to help support this program. If you're unable to donate, but you would still like to support Café Sci, the best thing that you can do is invite your friends to join us in the audience. If you don't have any friends, bring your coworkers, bring your enemies, whatever works. Café Sci takes place the first Monday of each month, and you can register for next month's speaker at carnegiesciencecenter.org. Although, on that note, we are making a very unusual change. Our next Café Sci after today will actually be on February 24th. That is a change we made to accommodate our next speaker's schedule. So there will be a February 24th Café Sci, no March, and we'll be back to our regular schedule in April. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd just like to remind everybody that there will be a Q&A after the talk. For our on-site audience, you can go ahead and raise your hand. We'll make sure to bring a microphone to you. Please wait until the microphone gets to you so everybody else in the audience can hear you, so Jen can hear you, so our online audiences can hear you as well. And for that online audience, you can ask your questions by using the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your Zoom window. You're welcome to drop those questions in at any time during the presentation, but we're going to hold them until the end. And it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Jennifer Sheridan. Let's give her a big hand. And so Jen will be presenting to us tonight what we heard in the shadows, frog call recording and specimen collection in Borneo. Jennifer Sheridan is the Associate Curator for the section of Amphibians and Reptiles at Carnegie Museum of Natural History and a tropical conservation ecologist. Her research interests are ecological responses to changes in both climate and habitat and land use. Jen utilizes frogs as study organisms, but with an eye for how they fit into the ecosystem as a whole. The main goal of her research is to understand and quantify threats to biodiversity in order to better focus conservation efforts and mitigate change. To those ends, Jennifer currently examines the effects of habitat alteration on amphibian communities and the effect of climate change on organism size. Understanding how species are separated in ecological space and how species are affected by changes in their environment allow for better predictions of biodiversity losses and potential mitigation techniques. The majority of Jennifer's research has been in Southeast Asia, mainly Sabah, Malaysia, and Borneo. But Jennifer also examines the impacts of climate change and land use change on amphibians in Pennsylvania, utilizing the CMNH collections, along with fieldwork at Powder Mill Research Station. So once again, let's give Jennifer a warm welcome.
Can you hear me? People in the back. Awesome, great. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for coming, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk today. As Sarah said, I'm going to be talking about frog call recording and specimen collection in Borneo. I'm seeing some faces from my last talk at CMNH, so apologies in advance if you've seen some of this before. There's going to be some overlap, but hopefully some new things as well. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about why specifically Borneo. This is a question I get asked a lot, in particular from my mother. So I want to explain a little bit why Borneo is so important and why I love working there. I'll tell you a little bit about my research broadly, including frog calls, how I use them, why researchers broadly use frog calls and are interested in them. And then we'll finish up with some outcomes of a trip that I made with Kara, who's here tonight. And so we'll talk about the results of that work and also what's next for my research program related to all of this. So let's start off with where is Borneo? If you were like me when I first went there, you may not be able to locate it on a map. So when I first got this job out of college to go to Borneo to be a field assistant to a graduate student, it was back in 1996, I had to get out my mother's atlas to find where Borneo was. So it's about 9,000 miles away on the opposite side of the planet. If there was a magical nonstop flight that would take me from Pittsburgh to Kota Kinabalu, the capital of Sabah where I work, this is the route that it would take. But that flight does not exist, sadly for me, so my flight route when I go tends to go through San Francisco, on to Singapore, and then either Kuala Lumpur or directly over to Kota Kinabalu. All told, these flights together equal anywhere from about 24 to 30 hours, not including time between your flights and time at the airport and getting to the airport and all of that jazz. So all of this to say is it's far, but as you will hopefully see shortly, it is well worth the journey. So let's zoom in a little bit and look at where Borneo is. So Borneo, this is Southeast Asia. This is the island of Borneo. The Philippines are up here. Mainland Southeast Asia with Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Mainland Malaysia, and then Indonesia down here. So Borneo is divided politically between 3 different countries. This part of Borneo belongs to Indonesia. These are the Kalimantan states. There's this tiny country called Brunei that's right here. And then the 2 states of Sarawak and Sabah belong to Malaysia. Most of my research is here in Sabah. And as I said, I've been going to Sabah since just after college. I first went as a field assistant to a woman who was doing her graduate research there, and it was the greatest 6 months of my life and sort of set me on the career path that I'm on now. But before I get into the details, well, let me also say that we're going to be talking a little bit about this part of Sabah today. So there's a mountain range that runs kind of through this part of Borneo here, and right here in this part of Sabah, it's referred to as the Crocker Range. So that's the area that we're going to be talking about where I was doing research last October, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But before we get into the details of frog calls, I do want to take a few minutes to talk a little bit more about why Borneo in particular. So we've said that it's really far, so why is it that I go all this way just to study frogs? Well, there's a few things that you should know about Borneo. One is that it is the world's 3rd largest island. And islands tend to have very unique flora and fauna. Most islands have what we call endemics, lots of endemics or organisms that exist there and nowhere else, and Borneo is no exception. Second, Borneo is home to the world's oldest and tallest rainforest. So the tallest rainforest tree in the world is this one. This is 94 meters tall, so almost the length of a football field. For comparison, you can see some humans down here. It's really hard to see, but those are some humans down there at the base of this tree. And so this rainforest is very, very old and very, very tall. The height of this forest, this kind of makes it look like this tree is an exception to the rule, but I assure you that there's many, many trees that are this tall in this broader landscape. These 2 areas in particular, you're seeing a lot of blue sky, in part because there's a stream right here. This is one of my study streams in eastern Sabah, and anytime you get streams, you have kind of a gap in the canopy. But by and large, you have very closed canopy, lots of thick, dense tree cover, and that provides lots of habitat for organisms to live. So this is just one of the ways that this forest supports so much diversity is by having this really tall and very old existing rainforest. Now, I talk a lot about biodiversity in the tropics, and I grew up in Detroit when I was really little, and when I was a little kid watching nature shows, you would hear that there's millions of species in the tropics, and my little kid brain could not fathom that. I thought scientists were making it up. I thought there's no possible way there's millions of species, because when I would look out my window, I saw grass, there was what we called the big tree in front of our house, and there was maybe a handful of birds. So I just could not fathom that. So you may have had the opportunity to travel more than I did at that age, so you may be familiar with tropical diversity, but in case you're not, I am going to hopefully try to put this in some context for you. So if we look at tree diversity in the United States as a whole, we know that there's 881 species of trees in the whole of the United States. When scientists study tree diversity in the tropics, they generally do what are called 50-hectare plots. A 50-hectare plot is about 5 football fields on a side. It's a half a kilometer by half a kilometer. I looked this up, and that's about 1/5 the size of Shadyside. So think of an area 1/5 the size of Shadyside. In Ecuador, in a 50-hectare plot, there are over 1,000 species of trees in an area 1/5 the size of Shadyside. So more tree diversity in a very small area in Ecuador, in the Amazon region of Ecuador, than there are in the whole of the United States. Pretty impressive, but not as impressive as Borneo. So in Borneo, in a 50-hectare plot, there are almost 1,500 species of trees in this 50-hectare plot. So almost twice the total tree diversity of the entirety of the United States in one area, just 1/5 the size of Shadyside. This to me is incredible that in an area 1/5 the size of Shadyside, you could have 1,500 trees at all, let alone 1,500 different species of trees. And we talk about this as scientists because this plant diversity really forms the basis of all other diversity. You tend to get what you see in the plant community. If you have a very diverse community, you tend to have very diverse other organisms as well. And that is true for Borneo. So looking broadly at the plant diversity, we have about 15,000, or we think there's about 15,000 species of trees or of plants overall in Borneo, including things like the Rafflesia. This is the world's largest flower. It's really interesting and cool. It kind of smells bad. It's pollinated by flies, and so it has this reputation for smelling like rotting flesh. I've never smelled it like rotting flesh, but that's how it attracts the flies, apparently. We also have the world's tallest moss. So this little plant here that looks like a baby conifer, that's actually moss. So I love things that are kind of weird and unexpected, and I don't know why, but I really love that big moss. Invertebrates, there's more than I can personally count. Just lowland arthropods alone are expected to exceed 13,000 species. Total butterflies estimated at about 1,000 species, and moths, including ones like this beautiful atlas moth, estimated at over 4,500 species. So lots of plants, lots of invertebrates. People love mammals, 288 species of mammals, including 13 species of primates. There's only two places in the world where you can see orangutans, the island of Borneo and the island of Sumatra. So I feel very lucky that when I'm out looking for frogs, I will often get to see things like a mom orangutan and her baby playing in the trees above me. So really great. People love birds too. 600 species of birds on the island of Borneo, including this really weird thing called the Bornean bristlehead. This is in something that is referred to as a monotypic family. So the family of this bird has only one species. It's this one. It exists only on the island of Borneo. So it's sort of this evolutionarily weird thing that scientists for a while didn't know where quite to place it. It looks like it's bald, but it's got tiny little feathers on the top and just really great coloring. We also have the world's smallest raptor. So this is the Borneo falconet. And when you look in the bird book for this bird, the drawing of this bird is it eating a moth. So as a raptor, it is so small that it takes things like moths. I just find them very, very charming. We also have lots of reptiles. It's estimated there's 300 species of reptiles. This is probably a lot more. Reptiles tend to be understudied right now on Borneo. We have great things like flying lizards, the Draco, and flying snakes, the Chrysopelia. So I love anything that sort of flies, that is not a bird, and these reptiles that fly, they're gliders, but they are referred to as the flyers. Really amazing. But let's be honest, the whole reason that we are here, and the whole reason you guys came tonight is because you want to hear about the frogs. So Borneo has about 200 species of amphibians. The amphibians on Borneo are frogs and caecilians. There's no salamanders on Borneo. Caecilians are limbless amphibians. They look a lot like a giant worm. But we're going to talk mostly tonight about frogs. The frog diversity is really incredible. And as an ecologist, I am really interested in how organisms relate to one another. And as a community ecologist, I'm not just interested in a single species, I'm really interested in all of the species in a given area. So when I go into the field and I'm doing surveys, I'm not just looking for one species at a time. I'm interested in what are all of the species in a given area? How many individuals are there of each species? What is the abundance? What are their sizes? And how are they affected by things like land use change and climate change? So we've established that Borneo has incredible diversity, but unfortunately for Borneo and its wildlife, it's not all rosy and amazing. So this is showing us basically deforestation over time. As of about 1950, most of Borneo was covered still in primary rainforest. Most of the island was old rainforest with a little bit of peat swamp and peat forest here in the south. The British had brought in the late 1800s rubber, so there was some clearing for rubber plantations, but it was fairly small scale. Human population density on the island of Borneo is historically fairly low, so there's lots of different human populations throughout the island, but again, very low population densities, practicing shifting agriculture at small scales. So prior to 1950, most of the island was covered in primary forest. You start to see in the 1980s clearing, mostly around the coastlines, as is commonly done. And then as we go through the last several decades, more and more clearing of that forest. And today, most of the forest that remains is sort of in this central mountain region, in part because it's harder to access. So a lot of this area has been cleared for timber and oil palm plantation, which we'll talk about in a second. So when we're talking about the forest, if you were to look out over a big expanse of that forest, this is kind of what it would look like. This is taken from an observation tower in eastern Sabah in a nice conservation area called Danam Valley. And this is kind of gives you a sense of what it would have looked like and what it does look like in the remaining forest areas. You have this big sort of carpet of trees. It's really dense forest, it's really high canopy. You kind of get this sense of this just like big pillowy abyss of trees. And when you cut it down for oil palm, as has happened over most of the island, the transition can be really stark. So this is a really great photo showing here some really nice forest intact, and then this is an oil palm plantation. So the oil palm plantation, the trees are cleared entirely. You get a lot of open area. It's always planted as a monoculture. You can see in this part of the photo, you cannot see the ground below that canopy, right? Here you can see the ground everywhere. Even when these oil palm trees are mature and old, you're gonna be able to see that ground. This area is gonna be a lot hotter, it's gonna be a lot drier, and overall you're losing almost all of the biodiversity from this area once you cut it down and plant oil palm. So oil palm plantations have driven most of the deforestation in Malaysia for the last several decades. So Borneo, because it's incredible, amazingly diverse, and it's also under threat. And as a conservation ecologist, this is something that is important to me to study before we lose what is there. So now we're going to talk about my work, what is it that I do, and how do I use frog calls. So as I said, I am a tropical conservation ecologist, and I chose this career focus because I am passionate about biodiversity and conservation. I work in Borneo, like I said, because the majority of life on Earth exists in the tropics, and the tropics also suffer the greatest threats to their biodiversity. So globally, the biggest rate of deforestation is currently in Southeast Asia. The Amazon loses more total area every year, but as a percentage of existing area, Southeast Asia has the highest rate of deforestation. And throughout my career, I've always asked questions or tried to address questions that are relevant to conservation so that my research can be applied to conservation. I mostly utilize frogs as my study organism. If you're interested, I can go on at length about why frogs are the best study organism. I love talking about frogs. I can convince you that frogs are the way to go if you're interested in becoming a biologist. And my research has three main areas of focus. So I work on species delimitation or describing new species. I work on issues of climate change, mostly how does body size respond to climate change. and finally, the effects of habitat fragmentation. And as part of all of these, I do field work in Borneo largely, and I make collections. So this is a picture of the alcohol house at CMNH. If you haven't been over there yet, I highly encourage you to come visit us. This is just a small part of our collection. We have 250,000 specimens in the section of amphibians and reptiles. And as curators, we often get asked, why do you need to keep collecting? You've got so many individuals already. You've got so many species in your collection. Why do you have to keep collecting more? And I think this is a really important question because I think it's important to hold ourselves accountable, to examine what we're doing and why we're doing it. But one thing that's really important to understand with respect to this question is that each of these specimens is a snapshot of life on Earth at the time and place it was collected. So when you make a specimen, you know that that species existed at that place and that time. We're going to collect a lot of information together with that specimen that's going to tell us about, say, the ecology of that species and how it's relating to other specimens or species in that same area. But just because species A existed, say, at Powder Mill in 1960, that doesn't mean that species is still there. It doesn't mean that that species hasn't changed. Species change over time for all different numbers of reasons. And so it's important for us as curators and museum professionals to continue collecting, so we're continuing to have these snapshots of life on Earth through time. And only by having this continued collection, these regular collections, are we going to be able to document diversity in a way that we and future generations are going to be able to fully understand the diversity of life on Earth and how that life on Earth changes over time, both naturally and in response to things like anthropogenic influences. Excuse me. Give me 1 second. Okay. And so this is just to show, this is global average temperature, and what we can see is over the last few decades, we know that global average temperature is increasing. We also know that it's increasing sort of faster and faster. At the same time, new additions to natural history collections are actually decreasing. So what we see here is that throughout the 1900s, from 1900 to about 1970, there was this really nice building up, more and more collections added each year. This is global natural history collections. But since about 1970, we've seen this really big, steep decline in new additions to natural history collections. This is basically inversely proportional to what's happening here. So just at the time when Earth is undergoing this massive change in its climate, we're actually documenting less and less of the diversity that exists. So this is setting ourselves and future generations up for challenges because we won't be able to rely on those natural history collections to fully understand what impacts we're having on diversity on Earth. So when we talk about specimens, what do we mean? What is a specimen? Generally, with herp collections, we think of something like this. So this is a specimen from Borneo. This is the Borneo horned frog, Mogophrys nasuta. This was collected in 2022. And generally, a specimen, whether it's an amphibian or reptile, this is kind of what we think. We fix it in formalin, meaning we inject it with formalin. We set it up in a tray. It's going to keep that shape then in perpetuity. After it's fixed, after about a week, you transfer it to ethanol, and it's stored long-term in our jars that we saw a minute ago in ethanol. Anytime you have a specimen like this, you're almost always collecting, or you should always be collecting, things like detailed locality data. So having detailed locality data tells you where that specimen came from. It allows us then to look at how species distributions might change over time, for example. In the last several decades, it's become commonplace to also collect DNA. Excuse me. So when you fix a specimen in formalin, that starts to degrade that DNA right away. So what scientists have started doing in the last couple of decades is to actually remove some part of that organism and preserving it separately before you expose it to formalin. With frogs and other herps, we generally take the liver. We take the liver because it's sort of in a place that's not going to disturb the rest of this specimen. Often when we use these whole bodies, we're looking at morphological measurements, meaning like how big it is, the proportions of its body sizes and things like that. If you remove the liver, you have all of the rest of the specimen intact. So we take out the liver, we put it in a little vial that either has alcohol or some other solution that's designed to preserve DNA, and then that allows us to do things like look at population genetics or evolutionary relationships between species, for example. And so all of this information together is what people in museums are starting to refer to as the extended specimen. So it's not just the specimen itself, it's things like its DNA, the locality data, a photo of it either in life or shortly after preservation that tells you what the color of that in life was, things like that. Every kind of collection has a different set of data that it will collect as part of that extended specimen. And as you might guess by the title of our talk, one thing that is really informative to go along with frog specimens are their calls. Now, calls aren't always collected, in part because you have to get a male, because only male frogs call, and in part because you may not always encounter that frog when it is calling. But if you can get that call, it gives you a lot of information that can sort of augment the rest of that specimen. So, why are calls important? Why do we care about frog calls? Well, frog calls are really interesting because they're what we refer to as a reproductively isolating mechanism. So just as some birds will only respond to a mate once they have a specific mating dance, for example, frogs will only respond to the call of a conspecific, the same species. So because of that, we know that the calls are basically an identifier of any given species. And so that means that frog calls can help us to define or delimit species. So just like we use their DNA, we use parts of different genes to help define species relationships, we can use those calls together with their genes, together with the morphology, to help define species. This is really helpful because a lot of times we find species that are what we refer to as morphologically cryptic. There are two species that are very, very similar outwardly or almost exactly the same outwardly. So if you were to just have them in your hand, you might not be able to tell them apart. But their genes and their calls are telling us these are actually very far apart evolutionarily. So the calls can help us with things like this. Additionally, knowing the calls can help us with what we refer to as passive acoustic monitoring. You may have heard about this with respect to birds, for example. So now, especially with AI and lots of other software, you can set out a little recorder like this. This is called an audio moth. These are really nice. They're fairly small. They cost only about $100. Lots of researchers are using these to monitor bird populations throughout the United States and lots of other places. And because birds are so popular, we have a huge library of bird calls. And using the existing library of bird calls, you can basically train your software to say, go through these recordings and tell me what species exist in this recording. You can set these, you can program these to record, say, 5 minutes at the top of every hour. You can program them to record at dawn or dusk, whatever you want. So it's a really nice way to kind of minimize the person power that it takes to survey an area. You set out some recorders, you can set up a bunch of recorders, you go back a week, 2, a month later, and then you run it through some AI software and you can figure out what bird species are in that area. Now here in North America, frog calls are fairly well defined also. So here in North America, you could do something similar with frog calls. You can set out these recorders, and then you can say, okay, which frogs are in this area? And this is something we're gonna be doing at Powder Mill starting this spring. We're gonna be putting out some audio moths, and I think that's gonna be a really nice complement to the bird survey data that exists out at Powder Mill. But, as you might guess, the frogs of Borneo are not so well known. Excuse me. So currently, there are 193 described species of frogs. Only about 67 of those, or about a third of them, have calls on a library of their calls. This really nice website called Frog Voices of Borneo. If you're interested in frog calls, I highly recommend checking it out. It's great. It was started by a colleague of mine, Omar Grafi, who's at the University of Brunei. So he and a friend of his started putting up these calls, which is a really great resource. So prior to the existence of this website a few years ago, there were only really a small handful of researchers in the world that knew any of the calls of the frogs of Borneo. I don't know how many people here have ever had like a field guide, like a paper guide. So I use paper guides all the time, like book field guides. If you've ever read the description of a call of a bird or a frog or anything, I just find like, I have no idea what this sounds like in real life. So having audio recordings that you can easily access is really, really valuable. I don't know if anyone ever had those like cassette tapes or CDs to learn calls of things. I've had those for different parts of the world. I never saw one for Borneo. But so having this website is really great. It allows us as researchers to, again, train the next generation and get more people familiar with these frog calls. And hopefully someday to be able to do kind of passive acoustic monitoring. So like I said, we currently only have about 67 or 1/3 of the species of Borneo on this website, and that makes it a challenge for things like passive acoustic monitoring. One of the reasons that passive acoustic monitoring could be really helpful is because the landscape in Borneo can be really challenging. So this is a picture on the side of Mount Kinabalu, the tallest peak in Southeast Asia at about 4,000 meters. It rises almost directly up from sea level pretty quickly. The person taking the photo is literally like 2 to 3 steps up the hill from us, but is above our heads. And we had to go down this way off the screen here to survey an area that had been surveyed decades before. So you can see this landscape is really rough. It's very difficult to access. I can tell you from years of experience and from reading the work of people who came before me who studied frogs, that if you just visit an area one time, you're gonna miss a lot of the diversity that's there. The frogs in Borneo breed year-round, so it's not like in the US where we have what we call explosive breeders. So if you just kind of know the right time to go, most of the frogs in the US are going to be breeding within kind of very specific windows. In Borneo, they're breeding year-round, and so you really have to go several times over several weeks to really get a full complement of the diversity, because what you see is kind of these ebbs and flows of abundance of those frogs. So some weeks you just get lucky and you see lots of things, other weeks you're just not going to see much. So having things like passive acoustic monitoring can be really helpful. Those passive acoustic monitoring and having a big library of calls is also really helpful just for understanding the natural history of species as well, and understanding how animals like frogs relate to each other and their environment. So for example, one really cool frog that we have learned about through its call recordings is this guy. So this is called Huia cavitimpanum, or the hole in the head frog. So you can see this tympanum, this tympanic membrane is sort of set back. It's kind of concave there. This frog actually, it turns out, makes ultrasonic calls. So this is really interesting because most recorders are not designed to record above the level of human hearing, because if you're designing a recorder, why would you allow it to record above the level of human hearing? So you have to get specialized recorders or set up your recorder in such a way that you can actually hear this. So I'm gonna, hopefully this is gonna work. I'm gonna play you this call. So this is the call of this species, and I want you to tell me if you can hear it. Please raise your hand if you hear it. You'll see it there. What? Oh my God. Who are these people with young ears? I'm like, you're all lying. So this is what I find really interesting, and I kind of jokingly fight with my partner who's much younger than me about this. Humans are born able to hear about up to 20 kilohertz. As you age, you lose this upper frequency range of hearing. I cannot hear anything now above maybe 15. and I did not think I was that old yet, and so I cannot hear a lot of this, but I learned that if you play this at a slower speed, which I am going to do for you now, you can hear it quite well there. So you can see the bar moving across the screen and coming across. And for me, I couldn't even hear like these upper ones as it's going across. Even this is half speed. So again, this is something that's really interesting that only came out through these call recordings, right? So there's only 2 species of frogs in the world that call in this ultrasonic range. We would not have known that before these frog calls were recorded. This is recordings that were made in 2023. I went with some colleagues to this Crocker Range in Sabah that I'm going to talk more about in a minute. And we went there specifically to record this species because we wanted to see how variable those calls of this species were across its range. It turns out the variability, as you can kind of see here, these are very different shapes of calls that it's making. And so there's huge variation within and between individuals at each of the sites, which was really interesting. We also recorded for the first time the calls of this species. This species is a ronid, a true frog. It was first described in 2011. The call had only been described as a chirp, but what we found in our recordings was that it makes a ton of different call types. So I'm not going to play all of these, but I'm going to play a few of them. So kind of like a chirp, another type of chirp, a different chirp, and another chirp. So lots of different chirps, but all very kind of different. So this level of variety of calls was very surprising. It also has something that my field assistant in 2022 told me that it makes this other kind of call, and I didn't believe him. I said, no, Merstogenus doesn't call like that. They have a chirp call. And he's like, no, I promise you, it makes this other call, this kind of trill. And I didn't believe it until I actually saw it calling with my own eyes. So this is interesting because the frequency is much lower than these other calls, and this is characteristic of territorial calls. And a territorial call had never been recorded for this genus before. So that was really exciting in 2023. Together with colleagues, we described this call, including this territorial call of this species. On that same trip in 2023, we heard the call of this small toad called Ansonia longidigita. This guy is about this big, not super large. You can see they're skinny bodied. They've got these really skinny limbs. And the known call of this species is this. So it's a set of about 12 trills at about this frequency. But what we were hearing was this. So instead of 12, you get these kind of pulses of 3. So an immediate question was, well, is this just variation within the species, or is it that these are 2 different species? So is this call description from Brunei actually the same species as this call we're seeing or hearing in Sabah? And so this was the driver for this past October. We didn't, in 2023, have the equipment to collect, so we made some call recordings of this guy, but I wanted to know, okay, what's going on? So I wanted to go back, get the specimen, get the calls together with the DNA so we can figure this out. So that brings us to field work in October 2024. So just to remind you, this is where we're talking about the Crocker Range here in Western Sabah. And to kind of give you a sense of what this looks like, this is when you fly into Kota Kinabalu. It's a big city. It's about 500,000 people. I'm not a big fan of Kota Kinabalu. It's very hot and kind of bustly, and it has that urban heat island effect. So you're always there's always a lot of traffic because it's grown up very fast. And I just want to get out of the city as fast as possible. But the Crocker Range is in a district called Tambunan, which is fantastic. It's one of the greatest places on the planet as far as I'm concerned. It's very laid back. It's kind of this big valley covered in rice paddies between mountain kind of ranges. There's very few people here compared to the big city. It's a little bit higher elevation, so it's not quite so hot, but it's not cold, so it's sort of this perfect temperature, and it's just wonderful as far as I'm concerned. The forest at Mahua looks kind of like, or exactly like this. This is a photo that Karen and I took in October. You see we've got these big dipterocarp trees. You've got this understory vegetation. Hopefully you get a sense that everything here is wet, so it rains a lot there, which just makes the forest really magical. And there's these beautiful clear streams. These streams are really great, especially this one at Mahua, because it's got so many different what we call microhabitats. So there's parts of the stream that are fairly shallow and fast flowing. There's parts of the stream where you have these slow open pools, lots of different depths of the water. Most of it is waist deep or less or more shallow. There's a few parts where it maybe comes up to your chest, but a lot of really shallow areas that you can walk through. And all of this means that there's lots of great places for lots of different species of frogs to hang out and breed and lay their eggs. So this is the forest at Mahua during the day. As I've said, we go out at night when we are looking for frogs. And when I tell people I go out into the forest at night, I think a lot of people think that the forest looks like this at night, but it does not. So we have headlamps that we take with us, but even without your headlamp, you tend to see something that's really, really incredible, and that is this glowing bioluminescent fungi and bacteria. And so when you are out in the forest at night, if you turn your headlamp off, you will actually get to see some really cool things like trees and the forest floor glowing. It doesn't happen every day, and it doesn't happen in every place all the time, but when you do get it, it is pretty magical. The other thing is, what does it look like when you're recording calls? So I don't have a great photo of myself call recording. This is my friend Jody Rowley. She's the curator at the Australian Museum. This is her in Vietnam, but this is a perfect photo kind of illustrating what it is like to record frog calls. You can see she's sitting in the dirt here. She's muddy, she's wet. She's got a recorder in one hand, she's got the microphone in the other, and she is staring intently at the frog that is calling. So you have to see that frog that's calling in order to make these call recordings. So this is what it's like when we go out. So that brings us then back to our Ansonia. The whole reason I wanted to go in October was to find and record this guy. So did we do it? The answer is yes. We got this guy on the second night. Karen and I were walking along the trail. I heard something that I couldn't immediately identify. We went down into the stream. I followed the sound, and I was able to find the individual that was calling. We made a nice recording, and luckily I was able to grab it before it got away. So it is now a specimen, and we have the call, we've got the DNA, and we've got the whole specimen. We're still waiting on the export of the specimens, but that will be here with us soon. And so very, very excited that on the second night, I could say success. I think I'm running low on time, so I'm going to go through the next several slides fairly quickly just to kind of make sure that we get through everything. But so this, we weren't only there just to get that one species, we wanted to make recordings of as many species as we could. And so one of the things that I was very excited about, this is called Phylautus neophilus. This thing is about 20 millimeters. They are extremely tiny, which makes them really hard to find, even though you can hear them calling. This was not in any call library that I could find. And did you hear that? So it's kind of that staccato call. We were able to get this call and the specimen of it. Another one of my favorites that we recorded is this. This is another Phylautus that's a little bit bigger, maybe about 40 to 50 millimeters. This is Phylautus microcellus. They look really mossy, which I really like. So you can see they've got this kind of like spines on their skin, and it just makes them really blend in really well with the moss. And they have two different types of calls. Aww. And this one. And then the other thing I really like is when you can compare sort of two different species within the same genus. So this is a high elevation species of this genus. The genus is Leptolalax. This genus has these slender bodies and really slender limbs, and they sound like this. And there's another frog in the background. And then this is the lower elevation. Oops, wait, sorry. Let's see. So very similar to the high elevation in a lot of ways. Overall, structurally very similar, but ultimately different, what we call dominant frequency and structure of those calls. The other kind of favorite of mine was this one. This is, again, a really small 25 millimeter-ish tree frog. You can see he's got these big toe pads, these big beautiful eyes, and this nice kind of orangey golden color here. And their call is, yeah. So cute. Okay, so in total we got 76 specimens in the 2 weeks that we were there, about a third of which have associated call recordings. And of those 76 specimens, they represent 6 of the 8 families known to occur on Borneo, including 15 genera and 28 species. 11 of those species in this collection are new to CMNH, which is really exciting for me to be able to be the first curator to bring some of these species into the collection. And some of the highlights from that include this one. This is the Borneo horned frog. I love this guy because if you see them, if you ever get a photo of it straight on, they just look mad all the time, but they just kind of sit there and they're big and heavy bodied and they're just really charismatic and charming. So we got a few species of this and a related genus called Xenophrys. This is a high elevation species. This is also a high elevation species, and both of these are new to CMNH. We also got 5 species of this genus that I was talking about earlier, the one with the big variety in its calls that we described for the first time, including these 2 species. This is called Ameropalmus, which I had never seen before, so I was really excited to see it. And also this one. Both of these are new to CMNH's collections. So just really quickly, what's next? So that was our October trip that we had. So where do we go from here? Well, thanks to some generous donors, I have funding to go back to Borneo this year and next year to build on that work that we've been talking about. And I will be making more call recordings, collecting more specimens, and also surveying frogs in 3 different regions of Sabah, and looking at primary forest, secondary forest, and agriculture, and looking at diversity and abundance and across those 3 land use types, and how those calls differ between those land use types. I'm excited too because don't worry about reading all of this. This was for a grant proposal we put together, but all of this is to say, this friend of mine who's a professional wildlife photographer and filmmaker, he'll be joining me in the field for 10 days this year and next year to document the work that we're doing. And together we'll be working with my Sabah colleagues in order to create content for both outreach and exhibits in Sabah parks and CMNH. And just to quickly touch on a couple of those elements, so one thing that we will be doing is making analog field guides. So a lot of us now access digital media. A lot of people use iNaturalist. Schools in Sabah are often very rural. They don't have access to the internet always. And so having analog, like paper guides, is really useful for some of these areas. So we want to make guides for school groups in English, Malay, and other local languages like Dusun. We are going to be presenting to schools. This is me presenting to a community near one of our streams in 2022. I really loved this day because I was telling these students about the work we were doing, and the stream in their community, even though it was in an agricultural area, had excellent diversity of frogs and abundance of frogs. And when I told them that, they all applauded. They were so proud of their stream. And so it's really great to be able to do things like this, and again, like share resources with those students and get kids excited. It was really great. A lot of these kids came up to me afterwards and told me they wanted to be scientists, or told me that they like going to look for frogs in their backyards. So we're really excited to continue doing that kind of stuff. And we will also be making checklists of the frogs of the different regions for Sabah parks to put in their visitor centers. So when people come, a lot of people in Borneo go to see mammals and birds, but we're hoping to get them to look for those frogs as well. So producing these checklists both in English and Malay. So hopefully I have convinced you that Borneo is amazing because of its diversity. It's worth working there because of that diversity and also the threats that it faces. I've talked a little bit about my work and how I use calls as part of all of the other research that I do. And we've talked a bit about the work that I've done recently and what is next. And with that, I would love to thank everyone for coming, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Jen. So we're going to go ahead. We're going to open the floor up to questions. We'll be interspersing questions from you wonderful on-site folks with our remote audience. I already have a slew of questions waiting for you in the chat. Folks were really excited about these frogs.
Awesome.
So I'll kick it off with one of those. And if any of you here have a question, put your hand up. Jill will bring you the mic. Please remember to speak into it. So let's start off with a question here from our online audience. A number of these came in fairly early in your talk.
No problem.
So we have an anonymous attendee who says, I'm not a biologist. Why does the Borneo rainforest have so much biodiversity?
Oh, man. There's sort of two parts to that question. One is that in the tropics, there's huge diversity overall, and there's lots of, not debate, but discussion in the scientific community about why is there so much diversity in the tropics. When you are a grad student and you're learning about global diversity, you will hear what is called the cradle versus museum debate, which is to say, are the tropics the cradle of life, or are they the museum of life? Meaning, is it that life evolves faster in the tropics, so you get more species because things are happening faster there? Or is it just that they've existed longer, meaning they've never been covered by ice sheets, for example? And is that the reason? There's lots of studies that go back and forth about whether it's cradle or museum, and it's probably some combination of the two. Generally speaking, the tropics, like we said, historically, they've never been covered in ice sheets, so the tropics have always kind of existed ice-free, which allows life to have existed for much longer there than, say, at the poles. You also get a constant supply of sunlight versus, say, closer to the poles. So whereas each of the poles and sort of north of about 35 degrees latitude, you get really strong seasonality, really long nights in the winters. The tropics, I used to live in Singapore, which is basically right on the equator, basically 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night every single day throughout the year. It's amazing. So that consistency of sunlight and energy being provided throughout the year and over time allows life to have kind of a consistent presence. Whereas here in Pittsburgh, we all know that winters can be really cold. Not a lot is going to be active out in the winters here in Pittsburgh. So it's partly that Borneo exists in the tropics, and tropical diversity is rich for any number of reasons. And like we said, Borneo is the world's oldest rainforest, so that is another reason why it is so diverse. Yeah.
Hi, Jennifer. It's on. Okay. I was wondering, as the frogs age, do their vocals change also?
Oh man, that is a great question. If you didn't hear, the question was, as frogs age, do their voices change? So one, I don't know is the short answer to that. I have not seen any research look at that question, in part, I think, because it's really difficult to track frogs in the wild over long periods of time. So I will do what's called toe clipping. So you can mark individuals and follow them over time. One way to do that is you clip kind of the fleshy part of their toe pad, and you can see them repeatedly on different surveys. But I don't think I've ever seen anything from one year to the next. And so they're either being taken out of the population, meaning they're getting eaten by something, or they're moving around, and it's really hard to follow individuals over time. Even in captivity, I don't think I've seen anything. I also think that they're probably going, not a lot of frogs sort of get to reach old age. So a lot of wild animals, but particularly amphibians, they just don't get to old age. They're not kind of like dying of old age in the population. They're going to be taken out of that population before they reach old age. So my guess is their voices probably don't change much. There may be some differences between juveniles and adults, but that would be, I think, the meat of it. But the short answer is nobody knows.
We have another question up here.
First, let me say thank you, Dr. Sheridan. It's a charming presentation. And I'm wondering, I was struck by the small children and thinking what a wonderful gift to the children of Borneo and to all of the people who are there, not just the children. Do you do that for folks in Pittsburgh, for children in Pittsburgh at the museum? Or I would love to know that you do.
Yeah, so this is one of the things I love about being a curator is that we get asked by, so I work at CMNH, and we get asked by our education team and the marketing team to participate in all of the sort of like outreach and public events. We get invitations from the education team to speak to, they get homeschool students that come through the museum for programming. We get invited by the education team to speak directly to homeschool students. We get a lot of summer campers coming through the museum, so all the curators get invited to participate in those summer camps. And so that's one of the things I really love is just getting to interact with people, both like, you know, we have these Super Science Saturdays that are geared towards young kids. We also have evening events for 21 and over. I was saying earlier that, you know, it's still the case that only about 30% of American adults have graduated college. And so I really like working in a museum where, you know, I was a professor before I started my job as curator, and I love teaching college students, but I also really like now as curator being able to chat with people of all different ages and kind of advancing science knowledge and science literacy to people of all stages of life, regardless of their background. So I do get to do it through the museum, yeah.
Online. One of our attendees asks, when you collect a specimen, do you collect already dead ones or do you have to kill them? If the latter, I feel sorry for them. I know they are sacrificed for science, but still, that is a direct quote.
Yeah, no, I feel bad too. The short answer is we always collect live ones. If there are times when you would take, say, like in the US, I've had roadkill of certain things. If the specimen is in good enough condition, you could take roadkill and it would still be useful. In Borneo, you're not really coming across anything that's dead. If something, again, like it's mostly gonna get eaten by another animal before I find it, whether it dies or, again, it's like there's not many things kind of like, pardon the pun, croaking out there of natural causes. But anyways, so we do collect them live. We put them to sleep using a fish anesthetic. So you basically overdose them on anesthetic, and that is hopefully the most ethical and gentle means possible to put them to sleep. And then we fix them in formalin. And it's terrible. Kara can tell you that when we were there, after several days of just collecting, it gets kind of disheartening. So I really like being in the field for longer periods of time where I don't have to be collecting every single day, because I love having the collections, but I don't love the process of having to put things to sleep. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question to that. So what happens if you see a species that you have never seen before? This is unique.
Man.
I know it's the dream. It's the dream. Are you going to collect it, or are you going to wait until you find a few more to make sure there's more?
No way, Jose. So the short answer is I am very excitable, as I don't know if you can tell from this talk. People who've been in the field with me can tell you that if I see something that I don't immediately recognize, my first reaction is, it's a new species. And so I get really excited. It often is not, but sometimes I want to like really will it into existence. Always collect it. Chances are, especially with amphibians, There are more out there. When I was in Sabah in 2022, I found a tree frog that I could not immediately identify. It looked very similar to something that I know, but it was not the right size by quite a bit. And it was a gravid female, and usually with gravid females, there's a very finite range, size range they exist in. And so we collected it. Because it's a tree frog, I know that most of the individuals are up in the tree canopy, and that you're only seeing them come down to, again, like eye level or whatever to breed. So I know that I'm not taking the last individual out of the population, and so I can safely collect it. There's a guy at the museum who's the vertebrate paleo curator. His name is Matt Lamana, and I jokingly refer to this frog as Rhacophoros lamanii because we joke that we're going to name frogs and dinosaurs after each other. So anyway, so the jury's still out on that one. It's unclear whether it is a new species. The group that it's in is very not well, I guess, defined, let's say. And so we have that specimen, but we're waiting on getting the genetic material to determine what it is. So you usually don't find things that are probably new species, but I get excited and like to pretend that it is.
All right, we have another question over here.
I'm gonna hop in real quick because we have an online one that also dovetails really well with that.
Okay.
Emily has asked, what is the process of exporting your specimens back to the US?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you have to have both export permits and import permits. So the country of Malaysia is pretty good about supporting researchers. So you have to have a Sabahan colleague who will support your research and your desire to export things. The law, and it's just good practice anyway, is to leave half of the specimens in country and bring half of the specimens back here. So you're knowledge sharing. So you're not just taking everything and leaving the Malaysians with nothing, you're depositing specimens in their museum as well as bringing things back here. So we bring back half of what we collect, and I have to get an export permit from the state of Sabah, and then I also have to register with US Fish and Wildlife to be able to bring that material into the US. It's actually not that bad of a process to bring things into the US if they're dead, I learned. So on one of my last trips, I had a cardboard box that I had packaged up all the specimens inside. When we do this, you take your specimens and you wrap them in cheesecloth that's soaked in ethanol so they stay nice and moist, and you triple bag it so that they don't leak all over the place. At least one of my bags leaked anyway, and when the customs agent opened the box, he could smell the alcohol, and he was like, oh yeah, these are dead. He's like, you're fine. So he didn't even really look through it. But you can get customs agents who will go through your list of what you have allocations for bringing in and double check everything, but usually as long as it's dead, I think they don't mind because it's not bringing in like foreign pathogens, basically. Yeah.
Thank you for a very engaging presentation. Really enjoyed it. You caught my eye with the photo of the specimen room earlier, and you said we should come over and visit. So how do we just come over and knock on the door, or should we make an appointment?
Wait, I missed part of that question with the photos of the specimen and then what?
Yeah, the specimen room.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
so you can come and visit. You just have to reach out to me or our collections manager. It's not on public view, so I don't know if anyone here has tried to see the collections at CMNH, but a lot of museums that are really old like ours, CMNH was from 1895, something like that. And so these older museums, a lot of older museums are trying to find ways to retrofit their spaces or bring the collections into public view. So on the ground floor of CMNH, we have the, I'm going to call it the Visible Dino Lab. I can't remember what it's technically called, but it's basically an area where you can see people working on the dinosaur bones. The alcohol house where our specimens are stored is not really on public display. We have a display on the ground floor called the Alcohol House Interactive that was meant to kind of bring our space to the public. So that's a really nice part of it. And we will eventually have small group tours coming through the alcohol house itself. so that you can see that space. But if anyone ever emails me, I'm more than happy to give people a tour. So you're all invited to email me and say, I'd love to see the alcohol house, and I will make it happen for you because I love showing people that space. Yeah.
Yeah, we have quite a few here.
All right, why don't you do a couple of online, and then we'll go right over here.
Okay, so we have an anonymous attendee here has just left us a impassioned comment, I think inspired by your really engaging talk, where they have typed in all capitals, "Why do so few people care about biodiversity loss? It is catastrophic."
Amen to that.
Amen, amen.
I agree.
And we have a question: how many of Borneo's critters are venomous, poisonous,
Oh, man.
or otherwise dangerous to humans?
Incredible question. I think not as many as people often fear. So people who have not spent a lot of time in the rainforest, I think, have this idea that everything out there is looking to kill you, and I really don't think that is the case. I have been very lucky. I'm also very cautious, but I have never had any major, knock on wood, problems in the field. I've gotten bitten and stung by a handful of things, mostly invertebrates. There's lots of stinging things, but what I have found is that when I get stung in the field, it hurts like a bear for about 5 minutes, and then it's fine. So I always, because it's so painful at first, I set my watch, and then I remind myself it's gonna pass in 5 minutes and you're gonna be fine, and it almost 100% of the time is. There are several venomous snakes. They are mostly sit-and-wait predators, the venomous snakes, and so if you don't put your hand in their mouth, you're gonna be fine. With the frogs, there are poisonous frogs, but they're not so poisonous that handling them is going to hurt you. With some of the frogs, if you handle them and you have a paper cut on your hand, it'll sting a little bit where you have that paper cut, but it's not going to do you any real harm. So I tell my students, just don't put the frog in your mouth and you'll be fine. There's lots of things, like you said, that sting. There's things like, there used to be wild pigs, but a lot of them have been wiped out by the swine flu that came through. Wild pigs were sort of notorious for kind of being a challenge. You don't want to come across wild pigs necessarily because they can be fairly aggressive. There are elephants, and if you are on foot, that can be challenging. But generally, because where I work, it's usually some kind of conservation area, field station, and so people talk and you know, okay, there's elephants over there, so don't go over there. So you basically avoid the areas where elephants are. I've had cases where I can't complete my last surveys of the field season because elephants are hanging out around my study stream. So again, I'm just cautious. I don't go and put myself in harm's way. So there are things, but if you're smart, then you're probably gonna be fine. There are amazing leeches. People get freaked out by this too. So leeches, if you haven't seen them in Borneo, they're land leeches. They sit on a leaf and kind of do this, and they look like kind of like an inchworm. They're looking for a warm mammal to hang on to. I've seen leeches on frogs, so they will climb onto anything they can, but they don't carry disease, and so I'm not really worried about it. The first few times I had one, it kind of freaked me out. But now I just kind of flick them off, and so it's not a real issue.
Well, that's a new nightmare unlocked. Land leech. All right. I know there was a question over here. Was it you?
I'm going to throw, while you're handing that microphone off, I like that you specified about the frogs that are poisonous are mostly not so much that, like you said, unless you put it in your mouth. We had another online question. Someone had noticed that you used bare hands in handling, and asked if there were any deleterious issues for you or for them.
Yeah, so that's a great question. In a lot of areas of the world, especially in the like Central and South American tropics, there's a fungal disease called chytrid that has infected a lot of frogs and other amphibians. And so researchers in those areas have to be really careful. Often they have to wear gloves to handle frogs, and they have to change their gloves between every individual because they don't want to risk, if any given frog has chytrid, transferring it to the next individual they're handling. In Southeast Asia, researchers have tested over and over again. Chytrid is there in very, very, very low quantities. We've never had massive die-offs like they had in Central and South America, so we're very lucky. So yeah, so when we go out, it's just our bare hands, and it's really nice because it's easy and convenient.
Recently, I heard about using artificial intelligence, where they were recording for years and years, we've heard about the whale sounds. And recently, they've been using AI to filter out all the extraneous sounds so they could determine this whale was talking to that whale like, hi, how are you?
Oh, man.
And I was wondering, with so many frog recordings that have existed, not only from your work, but from all the other people around the world, is there any consideration of using AI to work with the frog sounds to see if you could understand something about what the frogs are saying?
That's incredible. I hadn't thought about it specifically with frogs. So I studied birds for my master's, and I worked in Venezuela, and I worked on a ranch that is basically kind of like, I didn't know this until I was there, kind of has a long history of bird research on this little bird called the green-rumped parrotlet. And that bird has been studied extensively for things like this. And it turns out, they found out through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology that these birds are doing exactly what you said. They're saying, hi, Joe, I'm Bob. And like they're talking in these ways, and they were able to do that because of the amount of recordings they have of these birds. I have not heard of anyone doing that yet with frogs. And I think that's a really interesting question that now I want to figure out if anyone has started to look at that. The only thing that's kind of similar is, like I said, most calls that frogs make are, like, for lack of a better term, mating calls. They're advertisement calls by the males to tell females, I'm here. The call itself, the acoustic parameters of that call convey information to the female, such as how big that male is. So the frequency of that call changes based on the size of the male, so the females can listen to the males in the population and choose the biggest male. So what I don't know, and then you have things like territorial calls, right, which often sound very different from the mating calls. But I've never heard of anyone looking more specifically to say, okay, in these calls that have maybe multiple elements to them, are these different elements conveying different information? Is one of them saying like, hi? Is another one saying like, back off? Is another one saying like, I'm ready? Like, I don't know. So I think that's a great question that now I want to look into. But the short answer is I have not heard of it yet.
Good follow-ups online here, also pertaining to the specificities of the calls. So let's see here. When you record a call, sorry, this question is from Kitty Mama. When you record a call on your unattended recorders, I think you showed an image of them on the trees, how do you know which species produce it if it has not been previously recorded?
Yeah, so the short answer is you wouldn't automatically know unless you have an incredible depth of knowledge of not just frog calls, but other sounds as well. So there was a guy named, oh gosh, I'm gonna forget his name, Ted something, but he was a bird researcher, and he had the broadest knowledge of bird calls of anyone on the planet, and he was able to listen to call recordings from an area in, say, the Amazon, and he could tell you every species that was there. And there's at least one case where he said there's an unidentified species of this genus that's in that call recording, and somebody later went back to that same area and found the bird and described this new species based on him listening, because he knew every call that was described, and he could say, yes, he could identify it to genus because of how similar it was to the other members of the genus. I want to be that guy with frog calls of Borneo, but I am not yet. So that is my goal. So the short answer is you have to have a really deep knowledge of both frog calls, and then you have to be able to distinguish. So some of the calls that I played you, I think people would say, like, I've had students tell me, like, no, that's an insect calling. And I'm like, no, I promise you it's a frog. And so you have to know, what does an insect sound like in this area? What are the birds that are active at night that are maybe calling? What are the other sounds that you're hearing to be able to say, yes, this is the frogs, and this is maybe like one thing that we haven't yet identified, or at least identified the call of.
We have another call, oh, sorry, we have another question over here, but did you?
Give me
follow
one
up?
second. Yep. First of all, I just want to say that's fascinating. I hope that when that Tim person, whenever they're no longer with us, like maybe we can
He
preserve.
sadly passed away in a plane crash
Oh.
at the age of like 40-something
Oh.
with
With his brain,
like,
we didn't get it.
I mean, like it was so tragic. Like for me, as like I was a young tropical biologist at the time. You know, I think I was doing my master's. There was a guy named Al Gentry who was a plant biologist. They died in the same plane crash, and it was like the greatest loss of biodiversity knowledge in one event that ever exists. I know, tragic, and I didn't realize that the bird guy was so young when he died, and I just like looked that up recently and was like, oh my God. He was so accomplished for being so young.
That's
I
terrible.
know, terrible, yeah.
We have another kind of a follow-up here. Maybe we'll raise the temperature here a little bit. Also from Kitty Mama. She wants to know, how do the frogs react when you get down in front of them and put a microphone in their face?
Yeah, it really depends on the species. So some species, once you like kind of turn your headlamp off or kind of like turn it down, they just are so excited to call, they will just keep going, and they are not bothered by anyone in their face. Other species, they see you coming and they just close up and they will just like not say anything. Kara can tell you when we were out there, this is another thing about call recording, it's really slow work. So you may hear something calling, it takes you a while to find the individual that's calling because a lot of times there's multiple individuals of the same species calling. You have to know what is the individual you're targeting, so you have the specimen of the individual you've recorded, not just the same species that's calling in the same area. And so you have to see it calling as you're recording it. And so again, like sometimes you'll hear it calling, you'll find it, you'll put the microphone out, and you will wait half an hour and it never calls again. And so it can be really frustrating sometimes, but sometimes you get lucky. So it's slow and sometimes frustrating, but it's kind of nice to just be out in the forest and, you know, enjoying it.
So globally, are you aware of how frog species have done in terms of surviving our environmental impact?
I heard frog species surviving our environment. I think it's like, yeah, so the frogs of Borneo or frogs in general?
Globally.
Globally, so you may have heard frogs referred to as something like a bioindicator or a canary in a coal mine. So this is one thing that to me is really interesting about frogs is that they are pretty sensitive to environmental changes. So any given species has sort of a set of conditions under which it does really well. Broadly speaking, if you look across all the frog diversity, they can survive in incredible situations, like the wood frog can survive freezing. There are frogs that survive in deserts. They like secrete a cocoon around themselves when there's no rains in the desert to stay moist so they don't dehydrate. And then when rains come, that cocoon sort of like melts and they come up to the surface and they breed. So there's kind of broadly this ability for frogs as a whole to exist in lots of different environments, but any individual species is very, very sensitive to changes in their environment. So there's lots of cases where frogs have gone extinct. So documenting extinction is really, really difficult because you have to basically prove that it doesn't exist anywhere. And how do we know that we just haven't seen it? So it can be really challenging, but in the last couple of decades, there's a handful of species that have been declared extinct, either because of basically habitat loss or because of some combination of chytrid and climate change and habitat loss. And so frogs are the most threatened vertebrate group. So something like 36%-ish are threatened with extinction. So they're much more threatened than any other vertebrate group, which makes it challenging, and one of the other reasons why I love working on them, because it makes me feel like any information I can contribute about frog knowledge is helpful in hopefully preserving them. So frogs are not doing great, but I feel very lucky that in Borneo, aside from habitat loss, they seem to be doing okay. When you go into these primary forest areas and even secondary forest areas, you get big populations, lots of diversity.
frog noises that
Oh
attract?
man, any predators that make frog noises? That is a great question. I don't know of any predator that makes frog noises. I do know that there's this frog in, I think, Central and South America. It's called it's Physolemus pustulosus, which I cannot remember the common name of. But anyways, it has a couple of different elements to its call. They call it a whine and a chuck. And one of those makes it really attractive to females, but it also attracts bats. And so it's this sort of delicate balancing act because they want to make this call that's really attractive to females, but they have to be careful that they're not advertising their position to bats who will eat them. And so if you're interested, you can look this up. Just look for the whine and chuck frog in Central America, and you can see lots of great photos, bats coming to this, and lots of experiments that have been done, kind of editing the elements of those calls to try to figure out how it's balancing advertising to females and avoiding predators.
Right, in places like Borneo that you've witnessed for conservation of, you know, I mean, obviously the orangutan is like superstar species,
Yeah.
but like for conserving frogs, like obviously, you know, there's economic considerations.
Yeah.
But so how does that, what's
That's
your...
a great question. So I think that my experiences are a little bit skewed because most of the people that I interact with work for Saba Parks. And so I always thought, oh, everybody in Saba loves the forest and conservation, because everyone that I had interacted with was in Saba Parks. And the people who work for Saba Parks really love their job. They're very dedicated. You get people who then, like, their whole family works for Saba Parks. And so it's really, to me, like, great to see this, that they're jobs that people keep for their whole lives. People that I met in Saba Parks in 1996 still work there. And so it's really nice to kind of see that level of engagement. But I was talking last October to some people who work at Danum Valley, the conservation area, and they were telling me, it was a guy who was a guide for Danum, and he was saying that it's actually among people in their 20s and teenagers. He said that there's a lot of people who they never go into the forest, which is shocking to me, that they live in one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. He said that the first time he had gone into the forest, he was like 18 or 19, and I was like, what? So I think that there's a lot of variation depending on where people live and what their families do. I think that there are people who live adjacent to any of the Saba parks. They're probably getting more exposure than other people. And so I think it's like anywhere where there's kind of a mix. And I really love getting to interact with the people who work in places like Danum or who work for Saba parks, and to see that there's young people coming up who are like, yeah, this biodiversity is amazing, and I want to make sure that we learn about it, we're teaching kids about it, and we're like getting kids excited about it. So I think it's a mix, and I'm cautiously optimistic it'll continue to improve.
Online questions here also about kind of the physicality of the frogs. So we have Cindy who has asked, do any of these frogs change colors with their environment? And then we have a question from another audience member of Virginia asking if there is any physical change in the frogs when they make their noise, i.e. like their throat bulging.
Oh yeah. So the color question, yes. Their frogs will change color day to night. So at night they tend to be a little bit either brighter or paler. So there's frogs that are kind of yellowy brown. They're much paler at night, and then they're kind of very dark brownish during the day. Anything that has bright color, it's going to be dulled during the day. So those bright colors tend to come out at night, and then those colors are dull during the day. I haven't seen anything looking at color variation, kind of like, say, from primary forest to agriculture or anything, so that I don't know. As far as how they physically change when they're calling, there's a few different ways that frogs call that, yes, they're sort of, I think there's a picture a couple slides back where you can see the inflated throat sac. So sometimes frogs have one big throat sac. Sometimes they have paired what are called gular pouches. So they'll have these two different little skinny pouches that inflate with air. Some frogs, there's this really great frog that will, he sort of floats, and he's kind of just this big bulb, and he inflates his whole body with air, and then he pushes it out into his throat sac and makes this kind of boom, boom, boom. And so it's just like you get to see this like chubby guy like get skinny for a second and get fat, and it's like amazing to see that air moving through. So yeah, so there's a few different ways that they push air through those, across those vocal cords.
Fantastic. I honestly, if we ever have a frog call imitation contest,
Oh man,
I've got $10 on you, Jen. We've got another question here. I love this enthusiasm.
Have you seen frogs eating each other's eggs to like give it a competition?
I think there's something loud here. Can you say it again, please? Oh man, that is a great question. Frogs eating each other's eggs. Let me think about this. Immediately, no. I have seen a frog eat another frog, which I was very surprised by. There are tadpoles that will eat the other tadpoles or eggs of other species. I don't know if they're specifically targeting those other species or they're just eating whatever they find, and the eggs are fairly nutritious. And there are snakes that will eat frog eggs, but I don't think I've seen any adult frog eating the eggs of another frog. I think that, yeah, I have not heard of that. Lots of other things will eat frog eggs, especially there's tree frogs in Southeast Asia have these big foam nests, and snakes love to eat that big foamy mass. And I just, like, every time I see it, like, I don't know if you've ever seen a snake eat, but they kind of do this thing where they like move one side of their jaw forward and then they move the other side of their jaw forward. And I find that when I sit there watching it, I just do this. Like I'm imitating it somehow. And I was like, if I was a snake, I would eat that egg mass, yeah. So anyway, so snakes do eat frog eggs, but I've never heard of frogs eating other frogs' eggs. Yeah.
All right. This is the last question I have from our online audience. You had very briefly, I think, earlier mentioned something about working with guides, like local guides. So we did have a question here from Cindy asking if you take guides with you into the forest. What about snakes, other wild animals? You talked a little bit about the wild pigs.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to go into more detail.
Yeah, so one, I never go into the forest by myself. So just for safety reasons, you would never want to go just one person alone. You always want to have at least one other person with you. I always like to have someone from Sabah come with me into the forest in Sabah. Generally speaking, they know that forest, and so I like to have someone who knows the area really well, especially if I've never been there. When Kara and I were there in October, it was just the two of us, so we didn't have a Sabahan with us, but it was a places that I knew very well. We weren't going like off deep into the jungle on unmarked trails, so we were kind of like sticking to very safe areas. You mentioned like things like snakes. Interestingly, Sabahans are terrified of snakes. Even tiny things that could not get their mouth around your finger if they tried, they will cross the stream to get away from a tiny snake. They are just petrified of snakes in all shapes and forms. I one time was on a stream, it was starting to rain, and we were kind of huddled together talking about, okay, should we call off the survey because it's dangerous to be in the forest when there's heavy rains because of tree falls and branches and things. So like, yeah, I think we should go. Down the stream came swimming a reticulated python, probably a juvenile, not super big. One of my field assistants leapfrogged over me and someone else to get away from this thing. Even though the snake was not coming towards us, it was just going down the stream near us. So they're terrified of snakes, but it's always nice to have other people with you when you're in the forest. Yeah.
Right. Any more questions?
Any other questions?
Oh,
Yes, we have another question.
okay. Jill's on it.
I'm on it. Wearing running shoes.
The frogs seem to have a great variety of colors. We've seen that even in Phipps, they're now introducing some frogs into their new Panama exhibit that's coming up soon.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if anybody thought about, okay, the frogs have a vocal variety that's beyond our hearing. And do the frogs, is anybody thinking about, maybe the frogs are looking at the colors of each other?
Yeah, so there are people who study coloration in animals broadly and also specifically in frogs. That is a literature that I know very little about. So I have not, it's been a long time since I've looked at anything related to how animals perceive color. And I know that there's variation across the animal kingdom in how each different kind of group perceives color. And I could not tell you how frogs perceive color. So that is a great question that unfortunately I cannot answer. But I think it's a really interesting question to think about whether they're using that color. You know, I mentioned that there are some frogs in Borneo that are poisonous. They tend to be very brightly colored, so mostly bright green. And I don't know if that is a factor of just whatever chemicals they're producing that are toxic just happened to be greenish or impart that green color to their skin, or if that green coloration is somehow designed to warn predators, say, for example, or other individuals of the same species, if it's like an advertisement. There's one cool species in Sabah that has this kind of bluish-white webbing, and they do what's called foot flagging. So most frogs call, and this species does as well, but these frogs actually sit out during the day, and I can't really do it because I'm wearing a skirt, but they kind of like stretch their leg out and splay their toes and display this whitish blue color on their toes to females. So there is a little bit of kind of color displays going on sometimes, but beyond that, I'm not sure how frogs are perceiving each other's colors. Yeah.
Is there anybody else? Going once, going twice. I just learned the term foot flagging, so I will use that as much as I can. Sarah?
I just want to say that I am so glad that we learned tonight that there are like a Martha Graham of frogs that are like out there doing interpretive day. Here, I'll do it for you since I don't have a skirt on. Okay, folks, let's give another really big hand to Dr. Jen Sheridan. And if you like amphibians, please come back on February 24th. Again, unusual date. That will be in place of a March Café Sci. For our next presenter, who will be talking about when a salamander speaks amphibian responses to climate change in the Rocky Mountains. It's going to be a Dr. Howard Whiteman, who's visiting us from Kentucky. And again, just thank you so much to our Café Sci audience, both on site and online. This program would not exist without you. Please keep coming back. Please bring your friends. And once again, Jen, thank you so much for an engaging evening.
Awesome. Thank you. Come see the alcohol house.
Ladies